March 11, 1944. Over the North Sea at 5:42. And the North Sea lies still beneath a ceiling of unbroken gray. No horizon, no sun, only a wash of pale light against the iron weather. 30,000 feet above, condensation trails cross in long, measured strokes. White lines over emptiness, each one drawn by a machine holding to its task. Lieutenant Arthur Kell, 26, sits inside the narrow cockpit of his B-17. Frost grows along the edges of the glass like static in slow motion. The metal creaks once, settling against the cold. Inside the cabin, the air is thin, sharp, metallic. Temperature, -40. He breathes through a rubber mask, the sound of each exhale steady, contained. Then a flicker, a tremor along the oxygen gauge. The needle wavers, drops, climbs again. The flow is uneven. He feels it in his temples first, pressure shifting behind the eyes. He taps the gauge once with a gloved knuckle. The glass fogs slightly, then clears. No response from the system. Below the floor, the engines maintain their rhythm. 4 cylinders of timed explosion locked in mechanical chorus. The vibration travels through the seat, through the bones. Every rotation holds the weight of fuel, air, distance, logistics in motion. Outside, the formation stretches. 12 aircraft in line, disciplined geometry held against wind shear and ice. They are an airborne convoy. The system depends on symmetry. The loss of one breaks the pattern, weakens the defense. Orders: maintain position, no matter what. Kell watches the horizon. Far off, a vapor trail bends downward. Another aircraft has lost altitude, the line curving toward the undercast. A rule has been broken somewhere ahead. He checks his instruments again. Pressure continues to fall. Oxygen supply unreliable. At this height, blackout comes without warning. His co-pilot watches, waiting for a signal. No words exchanged. The radio hums with static. A thread of distant voices from other bombers. Coordinates, corrections, fuel reports. Routine language, stripped of tone. The manual for his aircraft is stored behind the navigator's seat. He knows the line by memory. Do not adjust oxygen valve in flight. The system was built to run itself. The man is expected to obey it, but the hiss in the hose grows faint. The edges of vision start to gray. He hesitates, then reaches. The wrench is small, wrapped in cloth to prevent freezing to metal. He turns it half a degree. The sound changes. Pressure stabilizes for an instant, pure and strong, then drops again. The needle falls into red. Somewhere beneath the aircraft, ice breaks loose from the wing root and spins away into the cloud. For 3 seconds, everything holds. Engines hum, instruments glow, breath returns in thin pulses. He keeps the formation, eyes fixed on the lead bomber's tail lights. By 05:49 hours, oxygen flow returns briefly, enough to finish the climb. The fault isolates, then corrects. Kell steadies his breathing, hands still on the yoke. No radio call, no deviation logged. At debrief, there will be no mention of it. Maintenance will find the faulty regulator. Note it as in-flight anomaly. Authority will record that the formation remained intact. The system functioned. The mission continues beyond this point, through flak, through cloud, through the mathematics of fuel and return. But here, over the gray sea, one small turn of metal decides whether a man keeps consciousness or joins the horizon. Later, his crew will remember nothing unusual, only that the engines never faltered, that the air remained steady. The quiet decisions leave no trace. Industrial systems depend on obedience, yet survive through disobedience measured in fractions. The machine endures because a man once turned the wrench. The record shows the squadron reached target altitude on schedule. No losses en route. No medals issued. The North Sea remains beneath, unchanged. Contrails dissolve into cloud, erased by wind. Would you have turned the wrench? Before the war, Arthur Kell had never left the ground. He worked inside the low light of a textile mill in Manchester. The air was thick with lint, the sound of the looms constant, metal against metal, rhythm without pause. His hands learned silence there, precision through repetition. He maintained the air regulators that kept the threads moving, the pressure valves that balanced the flow. He learned early that a system survives only when each part knows its limit. The foreman said Kell could hear imbalance before he saw it. He would pause beside a line of looms, tilt his head slightly, and locate the fault by sound alone. Others talked while they worked. He counted rotations. He did not speak of efficiency. He practiced it. When the war came, he enlisted as a mechanic. The Air Force reassigned him to flight school after an instructor noted how he stripped and rebuilt an engine faster than he spoke his own name. His bunkmates called him the technician who flew. He smoked only half a cigarette at a time, saving the rest for later shifts. He cleaned the oxygen manifold the way a machinist polishes a gauge until it reflected nothing but function. His calmness was not character. It was a method. Each action measured, each adjustment proven by repetition. During training, he memorized the B-17's oxygen system by tracing it with his fingertips from cylinder to outlet. He counted the turns, the weld seams, the faint rise of metal around each valve. He built a map, not in diagrams, but in touch. By night, others played cards. He lay awake, listing component pressures in order, like a prayer in numbers. He distrusted improvisation. Machines, he believed, did not forgive instinct unless it was informed by discipline. Yet he respected what he called mechanical truth, the sound and feel of a system telling its operator something was wrong before the gauges did. In his logbook, under maintenance notes, he once wrote, "Every failure begins with a whisper." Above the North Sea, at 30,000 feet, that whisper returned. The gauge trembled. Frost marked the seams of the glass. He recognized the signal the way a mill worker knows when air begins to thicken, pressure dropping almost imperceptibly across the flight line. He could sense it through the gloves, the faint difference between flow and vacuum, life and the slow silence of thin atmosphere. Duty ordered him to hold position, to wait for command confirmation. The manual forbade adjustment in flight. Procedure was absolute. But in Kell's hands, machinery was not doctrine. It was conversation. And the system was speaking. The intercom crackled once. His commander's voice came through, routine status check. Numbers read without concern. Kell did not reply. He was counting the seconds between breaths, listening to the rhythm falter. The air inside his mask felt heavier, less responsive. He marked the intervals in his head. 3 seconds, 4, 5. Each pause an instruction. He knew failure when it began with silence. The engines still roared, the instruments still glowed, but the oxygen line was starving itself in microdegrees. Machines, he had always said, warn before they die. The question is whether men listen in time. He looked once toward the horizon, where contrails merged into the gray. No visible threat, only process. Inside the bomber, Arthur Kell understood that calmness could be lethal when mistaken for inaction. His stillness was not waiting. It was measurement. He had spent his life keeping pressure balanced. Air in looms, air in lungs. Now, high above the sea, the difference between both was the same. A system relying on hands that knew how to listen. He inhaled once more. Slow, exact. The hiss was thinner. The whisper had become warning. The mission that morning was not combat. It was delivery. 12 B-17s moving northeast over the North Sea, each one carrying spare engine parts and hydraulic pumps bound for the 8th Air Force depots outside Bremen. The weight below their wings was the weight of continuity, machinery for more machinery, a flying warehouse scheduled to the minute. balanced between fuel margins and cloud cover. At altitude, the formation moved as one. Contrails stretched behind them in fixed alignment, white cords connecting aircraft that could not see each other through haze. Fighters cruised below, short on fuel, their presence more symbolic than protective. Above the fleet, the cold was absolute. Air froze on rivets. Steel carried sound differently. Inside Kell's aircraft, every system ticked within tolerance. Oil pressure steady. Turbos regulated. Oxygen flow unsteady. The gauge faltered, then corrected, a pattern repeating every few minutes. The problem was small, invisible, but constant. Each man aboard knew the purpose of their flight. Not glory, not combat, function. They were the unseen link that allowed others to fight. Every minute of delay meant one more grounded bomber, one more convoy stalled on the runway. The system they served was larger than them, older than the mission itself. A design of schedules, routes, and fuel mathematics that did not bend to weather or will. The supply chain in the sky was built on precision. Airspeed matched to fuel rate. Altitude balanced against oxygen burn, each adjustment calculated into the next like teeth on a gear. In wartime, the system was the artery. Men were its current. By 06:10 hours, frost began to grow thicker along the wing edges. Sunlight caught the ice, flashing silver lines that glinted like solder seams on a circuit, a pattern forming and dissolving with turbulence. The air inside the cockpit turned brittle. Frost formed along the valves of the oxygen manifold. White crystals growing across the fittings Kell had once cleaned by hand. He watched the regulator pulse weakly, a beat missing every 5th second. To the others, nothing seemed wrong. To him, the rhythm was imperfect. He could feel the system tiring. Outside, the formation held perfect spacing. A visual equation, 12 aircraft locked into distance by training and trust. The illusion of order, held together by the expectation that every machine would perform as built. But high in the thin cold, the design itself was cracking. The radio remained steady with traffic from the lead aircraft. Coordinates read, timings confirmed, acknowledgement tones repeating. Kell said nothing. His responsibility was air stability and oxygen control. Unseen duties that required no conversation. The margin for error was small. Seconds of breathable air before the body dulled, minutes before blackout. He adjusted the mix valve again, listening for the hiss to steady. It didn't. The sound faded, returned weakly, then faded once more. Beyond the nose of the bomber stretched only cloud. No sun, no horizon, just the slow drift of gray air. The formation seemed suspended, each aircraft believing in the system that held them. Fuel, flight plan, faith in design. The convoy continued east, trusting its pattern, trusting its numbers. No one yet knew that one of those numbers was already failing. Machines are built for endurance, not reassurance. The system does not speak in warnings, only in inconsistencies. Still, the bombers moved forward, their wings locked in silent alignment, their operators breathing thin air through faith and calculation. Orders had not changed. The mission continued. He still had no orders. Would you have waited? At 06:05, the disturbances began. Not alarms, not failures, just small hesitations within the rhythm. Aircraft 3 reported a momentary lag in engine revolutions. A signal flare misfired, its red trace dissolving into cloud before it could rise. Across the formation, oxygen gauges flickered, dipping and recovering without pattern. Nothing that justified breaking formation, nothing that demanded command intervention. Only systems nearing the edge of their design. Inside Kell's aircraft, frost advanced along the manifold's junction, a pale crust spreading faster than it should. Training had told him this was normal, condensation freezing against pressure change, but the growth rate was wrong. He knew it by sight, by instinct sharpened from years inside cold machinery. He wrote a brief note on the clipboard. Ambient moisture too high for altitude. The pencil lead broke. He did not replace it. There was no one to read the note if he didn't return. The air grew thinner, brittle against the lungs. Every exhale sounded mechanical. He watched the frost creep toward the valve line. The gauge needle trembled, steadied, then fell flat. He tapped the glass with his glove. No movement. He tapped again. Nothing. The manual sat in its pocket beside the seat, cover worn from handling. He opened it to the familiar page, 42. The diagram showed the oxygen regulator system in cross-section, each line labeled in neat blue print. His eyes stopped on the phrase underlined in red ink. Emergency bypass. Ground maintenance, use only. He had underlined it himself during training, to remind him that procedure had limits. The engines droned evenly, 4 turbines turning fuel into distance. Outside, the world had reduced to one color, gray on gray. The only reference point was the vapor trail of the lead aircraft ahead, a thin white line that swayed slightly in turbulence. But as Kell looked left across the formation, 2 bombers had begun to drift. Not visibly braking, just wobbling. Their contrails wove unevenly, like threads losing tension on a loom. He pressed his thumb to the gauge. The metal was so cold it burned through the glove. No pulse of air came through the line. The crew behind him breathed in shallow rhythm, unaware. Oxygen starvation was silent. It arrived like fatigue. The radio hissed once, then filled with static. Voices came through in fragments. Requests for pressure confirmation, acknowledgement, tones cut short by interference. No command replied. Communication dissolved into a low hum. He could hear his own breath louder than the net. Somewhere behind the clouds, a flare drifted down without meaning. Then nothing. No alarm, no shout. Only the steady grind of engines carrying a system that could not feel its own faults. Kell looked out again. One aircraft was gone. No smoke, no debris, no signal. Simply absent from formation. The others held their line as doctrine required. The structure absorbed the loss, unacknowledged. He returned his eyes to the lever. Its paint was chipped where countless gloved hands had hovered but never pulled. The manual had warned of feedback, rupture, potential decompression. It had not warned of silence. The needle did not rise. He could feel lightness in his fingertips, the body's quiet surrender to altitude. Still, he counted. 5 seconds per breath. 6. 7. The hiss was thin, metallic. The air around him was running out, not all at once, but in steady neglect. By 06:12, frost had sealed the valve seam entirely. The machine continued to run, indifferent to the men it carried. The formation advanced eastward through an unseen corridor of thin air, each bomber trusting the invisible artery above the sea. Kell kept his hand on the lever. The system had not corrected itself. It never would. Regulation dictated procedure. Any oxygen fault above 20,000 feet required immediate report to command. Descent would be coordinated. Formation integrity maintained through collective action. That was the rule, written in technical manuals, printed in red, memorized under supervision. But regulation had never met the thin air of 30,000 feet. Not like this. Kell understood timing the way an engineer understands vibration. Small delays could destroy entire systems. A descent here would break formation. A break in formation meant exposure. Exposure meant interception. The convoy's protection lay not in armor, but in geometry. Tight spacing, uniform altitude, synchronized endurance. His radio came alive with static. Then the voice of command, thin, distant, and strained. Maintain altitude. Maintain schedule. The words repeated once, then drowned in interference. No instruction beyond compliance. He looked at the regulator. Frost outlined every seam. The pressure needle had stopped moving entirely. His breathing was shallow now, the mask damp inside, cold against his face. He felt the first dull pulse in his temples, the warning signal before blackout. He kept one hand on the yoke, the other near the manifold. Procedure said, wait, But he remembered the mill. Before the war, he had stopped an entire production line because he heard a belt misalign by half a tooth. The foreman mocked him for it. Hours lost, wages questioned. A week later, the line failed, snapping under tension. The sound it made was identical to the hum of an oxygen pump struggling for equilibrium. Precision, he'd learned, was not obedience. It was observation, he calculated quietly. Oxygen tanks, 4. Primary regulator frozen. Secondary manifold still pressurized. Estimated consumption, 9 liters per minute, multiplied across crew positions. Remaining time, less than 10 minutes before the first man loses consciousness. To reroute flow, he would need to shut the primary valve and open the emergency bypass, a maintenance-only function. One mistake, and he would vent the entire reserve into the sky in under 60 seconds. He exhaled once, controlled. Hands steady, he closed the primary valve. A sharp click. The hiss vanished. For one long second, there was nothing. No flow, no sound, just the vibration of engines and the slow tightening of his chest. He opened the bypass half a turn. A faint hiss returned, uneven but present. Air moved again through the manifold. The gauge flickered, trembled near the 0 mark, then rose by a fraction. Not stable, not safe, but alive. Below the bomber, the North Sea reflected a pale sun, the surface metallic, unbroken. It looked almost solid, as if the aircraft were flying over welded steel. Above, vapor trails held their formation, the illusion of order intact. The convoy continued eastward. The system demanded obedience. The body demanded breath. Between them, one man held a valve halfway open, balancing both truths with the precision of survival. For 3 minutes, the flow held. Then it faltered again. His breath grew shallower, his vision narrowing at the edges. The world reduced to numbers. Pressure, altitude, seconds left. Every calculation was now a negotiation between regulation and instinct. He glanced once toward the lead aircraft. Its wings cut through cloud, unflinching, unbending. Orders remained absolute. He tightened his grip, refusing to close the bypass. The machine required submission. Life required interference. Somewhere, static still whispered on the radio. He inhaled through the fading hiss, thin and metallic. The equation was simple now: rule or survival. The system could not feel breath. Men could. How long can duty survive without air? At 06:17, Kell acted. No clearance, no report. The decision arrived between 2 breaths, the pause between duty and instinct. He reached for the maintenance lever, fingers numb from altitude, and pulled upward. The resistance was heavy, mechanical, built to remind the operator that this motion was not meant to happen in flight. A low vibration passed through the cockpit floor, faint but deliberate. It felt as if the aircraft had exhaled. The oxygen flow steadied. The gauge needle, once lifeless, began to rise. First a tremor, then a gradual return toward range. The faint hiss through the mask deepened. Breath came easier. His pulse slowed, but his hands continued to shake. He glanced across the formation. Contrails regained alignment, wings leveled. The machine restored its pattern. No signal of distress, no mention of fault. Around him, the intercom crackled to life with partial sentences, fragmented but human. Pressure holding. Copy that. Static. Then silence again. He didn't answer. He knew what the act meant. Unauthorized system interference. A technical violation carrying potential court-martial if recorded. Maintenance protocol was not a suggestion. It existed to preserve uniformity, the single language of machines. Every switch, every valve, had its chain of command. He had broken that chain. Still, the manifold held steady. The regulator hummed with new rhythm. Life returned quietly. Below, the sea was a mirror of steel, the horizon drawn as a single straight line. Above, the sky gave no sign that anything had occurred. Only within the system did the change register. A realignment of pressure, a recalibration by defiance. Kell kept the valve half open, his hand hovering near the lever. The balance was delicate. Too much feed, and he would vent reserves. Too little, and the crew would fade again. He adjusted trim with his other hand, correcting minor drift, the bomber returning to grid position within the convoy. Somewhere behind, one aircraft still lagged. Its vapor trail thinned, breaking unevenly before disappearing into cloud. He counted, 5 seconds, then 10, waiting for its reappearance. Nothing. He looked again at his gauges. The lines were stable, the air was steady, but silence remained. The radio carried no confirmation, no acknowledgement that anyone else had survived the fault. He spoke once into the microphone, voice controlled, "Formation oxygen check." The reply came as static, fading under engine resonance. He leaned back, mask tight against his face, and stared at the frost receding from the manifold seam. The ice melted unevenly, leaving small droplets that glistened on the metal. For the first time since 0605, the system looked alive. Outside, a faint wisp of vapor escaped from the bomber's underbelly, a trace of tampering. It stretched for a moment in the thin air, then vanished into wind. No one below would ever know one aircraft had nearly suffocated. The manuals never accounted for judgment. They assumed survival could be diagrammed, lines, valves, and regulated flow. But systems rely on people who see what the diagrams cannot. He wrote nothing in the log. He closed the clipboard, returned the manual to its slot, and kept the lever where it was. The sky ahead was featureless. The convoy moved on. Machines obeyed rules. Men endured consequences. What happens when survival demands breaking both? At 0630, the network began to fracture. Voices came through the static, uneven, cut short by distance and interference. Fragments of numbers, half a phrase, then the long hum of open air. 2 aircraft had failed to maintain altitude. One was missing entirely. The convoy pattern no longer aligned on the navigation grid. Fuel transfer data, once identical across the formation, now showed irregular draw. A single column, broken into segments. Kell adjusted the receiver dial, listening for confirmation. The sound was thin, the pitch unstable. Somewhere inside the static, a voice reported descent into cloud cover, then cut. Silence followed. It stayed. He looked out through the frost-blurred glass. Where the line of bombers should have stretched across the horizon, there was only empty air. Contrails drifted apart, fading like chalk marks in wind. His oxygen system held steady. The indicator needle sat within limits, unmoving. The adjustment, the forbidden one, had worked. He felt the faint hum of pressure equalization through the floor. The aircraft breathed evenly again. Around him, the crew remained at stations. No one spoke. The intercom lights glowed dimly, their purpose redundant now. Communication meant nothing if no one replied. At 0634, a short burst of radio transmission broke through the silence. 4 seconds of garbled tone, the end clipped. It carried no words, only rhythm. Signal, pause. Signal, stop. Then quiet again. By 0640, the escort fighters continued east, unaware half their convoy was gone. Their fuel clocks would not forgive a detour. Protocol demanded they stay on course. Kell's bomber remained level, altitude constant. The clouds beneath thickened, closing over the sea like a sealed lid. The sunlight fractured across the upper atmosphere, pale and metallic. He recalculated the oxygen consumption rate, holding within margin. The adjustment had been correct, but the rest of the formation had not adapted. Whether by hesitation or discipline, they had obeyed the system until it failed them. He spoke once more into the transmitter, voice flat and procedural. Formation status check. The reply came as static. Then, nothing. The absence of communication became its own kind of message. Elsewhere, A single distress tone flickered across frequency 4 to 7. It was faint, almost erased by range. No words followed. No acknowledgement. Then, only engine noise and the constant hiss of surviving airflow. At 06:55, headquarters relayed confirmation through coded burst. 5 aircraft unaccounted for, presumed lost due to oxygen system failure. Remaining 7 reached the drop zone on schedule. Mission complete. Kell noted the time. He wrote the figures in his logbook with precision. Altitude, pressure, temperature. One line beneath, he added, manual flow adjustment successful. He knew the phrase would never appear in final record. It would be redacted as procedural deviation, a maintenance anomaly. The official file would mark the losses as mechanical variance. Outside, vapor drifted across the wings, thin and soundless. The sea was invisible now, buried under cloud. The sky remained calm, almost sterile. Sat back in silence, mask pressed tight, breath measured against the sound of the engines. The system had endured, but not for all. Survival, he understood, was not distributed evenly. Upon return, the airfield was quiet. Engines wound down one by one, the sound flattening into the wind. Mechanics moved between aircraft with the rhythm of habit. Hoses unlatched, panels opened, data logged. The war did not pause for loss. It only adjusted its figures. Inside the debriefing room, the report was procedural. Oxygen loss acknowledged. No enemy contact. No technical malfunction confirmed. The summary box remained blank where cause should be. Kell sat through the review without remark. His gloves were still marked with oil from the manifold lever. The officer across from him read the log, page by page, lips moving without sound. When finished, he signed the margin, folded the paper, and passed it to the clerk. No questions followed. No reprimand, no praise. The report moved upward through channels, reclassified twice before it reached headquarters. By the next morning, it returned stamped filed. Atmospheric variance. The phrase carried no blame. It also carried no truth. In the maintenance hangar, engineers studied his notes, handwritten margins, flow rates, temperature deviations. His name was on the cover sheet when they received it. It was not when they returned it. Weeks later, a technical bulletin circulated through the service units. The oxygen regulator redesign, minor, unannounced, adjusted the same valve Kell had moved in flight. The footnote referenced a field adaptation. No source cited. His commanding officer thanked him in passing that afternoon. The words were brief, offered without eye contact. Gratitude reduced to protocol. Then he moved on to the next report. By evening, the base canteen was full. Metal trays, steam, the scrape of cutlery against tin. Kell sat alone at the edge of the table, cutting his meal into exact halves before eating. His movements were slow, deliberate, same as his flight. Around him, men spoke of replacement crews, new schedules, fuel allotments for the next run. The convoy system continued, precise as ever. He heard fragments of rumor. Headquarters had requested flight data, but the recordings were incomplete. The missing aircraft had failed to transmit before descent. Their final positions were marked as uncertain. The official term was unverified contact loss. The next missions were already listed on the notice board. No suspension, no delay. The line of aircraft would lift again within days, carrying the same fuel, same oxygen systems, slightly modified, quietly improved. In his quarters, Kell unpacked his flight kit. The wrench he had used on the valve lay in the bottom pocket, its surface dull from frost residue. He cleaned it, polished the edges, wrapped it in cloth. He kept it not as a trophy, but as a reminder, a piece of machinery that had allowed defiance to align with function. There was no medal, no reprimand, only a faint ache between instinct and regulation. The war machine had absorbed his action without recognition, as it absorbed everything. The fuel, the metal, the men. Efficiency left no room for memory. By nightfall, The base lights dimmed one by one. Trucks moved along the perimeter road. Headlights steady, engines low. The sound was identical to every night before. The system endured. He continued flying. No one asked how he had known the system would fail. Perhaps they did not want to know. History keeps the loud names, the ones tied to destruction, not repair. The technicians, the maintainers, the men who made air breathable at altitude, those names dissolve between the pages. Kells did. It appeared once in a record, attached to a maintenance summary dated March 1943. The entry described oxygen irregularities and a note in the margin. Manual flow adjustment successful. Nothing else. No signature. No citation. The phrase outlived its author. In technical briefings that followed, it appeared again, repeated, shortened, refined. Within a year, manual oxygen fix became standard language in training syllabi. No one asked where it began. The system had already digested the act, turned disobedience into doctrine. Across the factories and depots, the war's rhythm continued. Rivets, fuel drums, calibration tables. Men worked by the tick of shift clocks, their gestures identical, their hands stained by machinery. The heroism of logistics was its silence. Steel moved, systems held, aircraft lifted. Survival depended on the maintenance nobody saw. Kell's contribution became a pattern, not a story. A new valve type entered production 6 months later, incorporating the same reroute he had discovered mid-flight. The paperwork credited collective field observations. Precision had replaced memory. By 1945, the manual fix was a paragraph in the operations handbook. Engineers repeated it as procedure. Young pilots performed it during drills, unaware that it had once been forbidden. The act that had risked a court-martial became regulation, absorbed, anonymized, perfected by repetition. There is a quiet philosophy in this transformation. Systems, when efficient, erase their origins. They replace instinct with process. They reward uniformity over insight. Yet it is insight that first keeps the machine alive. Every valve turned in crisis, every wrench lifted against instruction, is a negotiation between survival and obedience. The difference is measured in seconds, in air pressure, in the hum of an engine that continues when it should have failed. Decades later, when the archives were digitized, Kell's note reappeared. The file carried no photograph, no service citation, only those 3 words, manual flow adjustment, nested between weather reports and fuel records. The historians who reviewed it could not trace its significance. The metadata showed no reference link. The human decision behind the phrase had vanished, but its effect remained embedded in every aircraft that followed. That is how such legacies endure. Not as names, but as tolerances, revised schematics, safer margins. The war's great machines owed their longevity not to glory, but to those invisible corrections made under pressure. When historians list victories, they count sorties, tonnage, targets. They seldom count the seconds between suffocation and breath. Yet entire missions survived in those seconds. Entire crews owed their return to a hand that disobeyed procedure long enough to find a better rule. The manuals never mentioned conscience. They spoke only of flow rates and failure thresholds. But every system, no matter how industrial, still required human judgment to keep the air moving. The record ends there. No medal, no headline, only a process improved by one man's refusal to trust the diagram over his own senses. Obedience maintains systems. Observation sustains life. How many victories began with one mechanic breaking a rule to keep the air moving?